Hello and welcome to our webinar. Today, we'll be covering a call for evidence on preparing a restriction for aromatic brominated flame retardants. I'm Adam Elwan from ECHA's Communications Unit, and I'll be guiding you through today's session. Let me briefly outline what you can expect from today's webinar. First, we'll introduce the REACH restriction process, explaining why this work is important and how it fits into the broader regulatory landscape. Next, we'll cover the background and scope of the current mandate, including which substances and product types are in focus and why. We'll then guide you through how to participate in the consultation, including practical tips for completing the survey and submitting evidence. So, a few words about the Q&A today. You can send your questions anytime either at slido.com using the event code ABFR or by scanning the QR code on this slide. We'll answer until 1 Helsinki time, that's 12 CET. Now, we also ask that you keep your questions within today's scope. For any other questions, you can send them to us at echa.europa.eu/contact. If we don't manage to cover your question during the event, a consolidated Q&A will be published afterwards. All the materials from today will be available on our webinar page. This includes the recording, the presentation slides, and a post-event Q&A. The slides are already available, the recording soon after we close, and the Q&A will follow shortly after the webinar. All right, let's take a closer look at today's program. After my short introduction, Marta will introduce the REACH restriction process, explaining the regulatory background and why this work is important. After her, Jesus will take us through the mandate's background and scope, outlining which substances and product types are in focus and why. Then, Nina will explain how you can participate in the consultation, including practical tips for submitting your evidence and feedback. I'll then wrap up with some conclusions and key takeaways. Now it's time to start the first presentation on the REACH restriction process. Marta, please go ahead.
Hello, my name is Marta Salo. I work in the Restrictions Management Unit in ECHA, which is responsible for restriction-related activities. Before we jump into the REACH restriction process, I would first like to set the scene and give you a recap of why we are here today. As you may have already seen on the ECHA website, we have received a mandate from the European Commission. The mandate consists of two parts. Firstly, it requests ECHA to prepare a restriction proposal on certain non-polymeric aromatic brominated flame retardants, or ABFRs as we refer to them for short. Secondly, the mandate requests ECHA to prepare an investigation report on organophosphorus flame retardants and other potential alternatives to the ABFRs. My colleague Jesus will give you more information on the mandate in the next part of this presentation. In preparation for this work, we are reaching out to stakeholders and have launched a call for evidence on ECHA's website to gather any relevant information. With this call for evidence, we are particularly aiming to gather information on the use of ABFRs, the likely response to the restriction, and the impacts of the restriction. My colleague Nina will give you more information on the call for evidence in the final part of this presentation. This leads me to the main point of why we are here today. As Adam also mentioned during his introduction, we aim to achieve several things with this webinar. Firstly, we would like to give you an introduction to the restriction process, particularly the main process steps and timelines, so that you know what to expect going forward. Next, we aim to inform you about the scope of the mandate and how ECHA plans to approach it. This should give you an idea of how you may be affected and what information may be relevant for ECHA to take into consideration. Finally, we aim to guide you in the call for evidence so that you are aware what information we are currently requesting and how you can contribute. Now I will walk you through the restriction process, starting with what a REACH restriction is. A restriction is a regulatory tool for protecting human health and the environment from risks posed by chemicals. It is used as a safety net when a risk is not adequately controlled and where action is required at the union level. Restrictions are very versatile. They can be quite broad, which is the more usual approach, whereby they limit or ban the manufacture, placing on the market, or use of a substance, on its own, in a mixture, or in an article. They can target one substance or a group made of several substances. Alternatively, restrictions can be quite specific and set out specific conditions such as technical measures, limits, or even labeling requirements. Under the REACH framework, a restriction can be proposed either by a member state, this can be one or several working together, or it can be proposed by ECHA at the request of the European Commission, as is the case for the ABFR restriction in focus of today's webinar. Now that you have a general understanding of what a restriction under REACH is, let's take a closer look at how a restriction proposal is made. A restriction proposal is made by preparing what we call an Annex 15 dossier. The name Annex 15 comes from the Annex 15 of the REACH regulation, which lays out the general principles of restriction dossier preparation. It's important to note that REACH also puts in place a legal time requirement, so that the Annex 15 dossier must be prepared and submitted for evaluation within 12 months. In accordance with Annex 15, a dossier generally includes the following elements. It includes a section on the proposal. The proposal describes which substances are targeted by the restriction and what are the proposed conditions. For example, the conditions of a proposed restriction can call for a ban on the placing on the market of mixtures containing a certain substance above a specific concentration threshold. Finally, the proposal also includes a summary of the justification outlining the arguments in support of the restriction. The dossier also includes information on the hazards, the exposure, and the risk of the substances in scope of the restriction proposal. Ultimately, the aim of this section is to characterize the risk and establish that risks are considered not adequately controlled. In simple terms, we can look at this section as a definition of the problem that the restriction aims to address. Another element included in the dossier is the justification for action at EU level. As the title suggests, this section contains arguments as to why union-level action is required to address the risks identified. For example, avoiding distortion of the internal market or the need to address cross-border risks can be relevant arguments used to support EU-level action. In addition to a justification in support of EU-level action, this section must also contain a justification as to why specifically a restriction is the most appropriate EU-wide measure. This is based on 3 criteria, namely that the restriction is effective, practical, and monitorable. Moving on, the dossier also contains a section summarizing the available information on alternatives. This section contains an overview of any alternatives that could potentially serve as substitutes to the substances targeted by the restriction. This section also includes information on the technical and economic feasibility and risks of each alternative. Ultimately, the aim of this section is to detail the most likely response from the industry to the restriction in terms of substitution. The dossier must also contain a section detailing the analysis of socioeconomic impacts. As the name suggests, this section contains an overview of the economic and social impacts incurred as a result of the restriction. The general aim of this section is to examine the net benefits as compared to the net costs, and to consider the proportionality of the proposed restriction. Finally, and importantly, the dossier contains a section detailing the information received from consultation with stakeholders, including the results of any call for evidence. To sum up, the collective aim of these different elements and the dossier as a whole is to demonstrate that the proposed restriction is the most appropriate regulatory risk management measure to address the identified risk. Now I will walk you through the general steps and timelines of the restriction process. The first phase of the restriction process is dossier preparation. As stated in the previous slide, this phase lasts a total of 12 months. The main actor is the dossier submitter, which, as mentioned earlier, can be either ECHA at the request of the European Commission or a member state. The beginning of this phase is marked by the submission to ECHA of a notification of intention to submit a restriction proposal. The intention is published on the Registry of Intentions that is hosted on ECHA's website, with the aim to enable interested parties, such as organizations, companies, authorities, to plan for and contribute to the consultations held throughout the restriction process. Once the dossier has been prepared and is submitted to ECHA for evaluation, the process moves to the next phase called opinion making. This phase generally lasts between 12 to 15 months and is mainly carried out by ECHA scientific committees, RAC and SEAC. During the opinion-making phase, RAC and SEAC scrutinize the restriction proposal. Firstly, they check that the dossier conforms to the legal requirements laid out under Annex 15 of REACH. If the dossier is found to be in conformity, RAC and SEAC will proceed to evaluate it, compiling their evaluation and conclusions in an opinion document. Running in parallel to the opinion development are two third-party consultations. Immediately following the conformity check, there is a consultation on the Annex 15 dossier, and in the later stages of the process, there is a consultation allowing stakeholders to comment on SEAC's draft opinion. Relevant information from both consultations is taken into consideration by the committees as part of their opinion development. Finally, I would just like to highlight that in addition to RAC and SEAC, ECHA's network of enforcement authorities, known as Forum, also plays a role in evaluating the proposal. Utilizing their expertise, Forum provides advice specifically regarding the enforceability of the restriction and highlights any potential challenges. Once the opinions of RAC and SEAC are adopted, the restriction proposal, together with the opinion from RAC and SEAC, are submitted to the European Commission for their consideration, bringing us to the decision-making phase. This phase typically lasts at least 1 year and is mainly carried out by the European Commission, supported by member states. The decision on the restriction proposal is taken by the European Commission, together with member states via a voting procedure. Next, the restriction is scrutinized by the European Parliament and the European Council, and is then finally adopted into law. Next, let's take a look at where we are currently in the process, specifically for the restriction proposal on ABFRs. As a reminder, in December of last year, we received the mandate from the European Commission to prepare a restriction proposal on certain non-polymeric ABFRs and an investigation report on organophosphorus flame retardants and potential alternatives to certain non-polymeric ABFRs. On the 21st of January of this year, we launched a call for evidence on the ECHA website to gather information in support of this work. As you can see from the orange arrow, this is where we are today. The call for evidence is currently running and will be open until the 18th of March. In parallel to the call for evidence, we are also continuously working on the dossier. We are collecting data, analyzing it, and drafting the text. It is important to highlight that even though we formally have a full year to prepare and submit the dossier, in practice we have less time than this, especially when it comes to the data collection and analysis. Therefore, it is important to be aware that the drafting of the restriction dossier will mostly take place until the end of June of this year, meaning that any relevant information should be taken into consideration within this time frame. Now let's take a quick look at what comes next. The finalized Annex 15 restriction proposal will be submitted for evaluation in December of this year. Following that, during 2027 until somewhere in 2028, ECHA's committees for risk assessment and socioeconomic analysis will evaluate the proposal as part of the opinion development. Next, the decision-making will take place during the following year or so, around 2028 to 2029 as an estimation. During this time, the European Commission will propose a draft restriction and will take the final decision together with member states via a voting procedure. This finally brings us to the entry into force. The exact date here is, of course, subject to change. However, we present here the year 2030 as a pragmatic assumption made for the purposes for the call for evidence. This finally brings us to the end of this part of the presentation. I won't elaborate too much on the future steps of the restriction process, as you will have more opportunities to hear details about this as we enter later stages in the process. Nevertheless, I would like to give you a brief introduction so that you know what to expect going forward. Once the dossier is submitted at the end of this year, it will be evaluated by ECHA's scientific committees. These committees consist of independent experts that are nominated by member states. As mentioned before, there are 2 committees involved, each focusing on the elements within their purview. One is the Risk Assessment Committee, or RAC for short, which focuses on the hazards, exposure, risks, and risk reduction. RAC will spend 9 months scrutinizing the dossier and writing an opinion so as to conclude whether the suggested restriction is appropriate in reducing the risk. The other committee is the Socioeconomic Analysis Committee, or SEAC for short, which focuses on the analysis of alternatives and socioeconomic impacts. SEAC will spend 12 months scrutinizing the dossier and writing an opinion so as to consider the socioeconomic impacts of the suggested restriction and to conclude whether the restriction is proportionate to the risk. With that, I would like to thank you for your attention. I will now hand over to my colleague Jesus, who will guide you through the next part of this webinar.
Good morning. My name is Jesus Vázquez, and in this presentation, I will cover the background and scope of the mandate that the European Commission sent to ECHA regarding the preparation of a restriction dossier for certain aromatic brominated flame retardants, or ABFRs, and an investigation report on organophosphorus flame retardants and alternatives to certain aromatic brominated flame retardants. But let me start with the background of why we are here. During 2021 and 2022, ECHA assessed several groups of substances created around brominated flame retardants and organophosphorus flame retardants that were not previously regulated. The conclusions of those assessments were collected in reports that are called Assessments of Regulatory Needs. Next, on March 2023, ECHA published the Regulatory Strategy for Flame Retardants. This regulatory strategy builds further on the conclusions from the previous assessments. In this regulatory strategy, ECHA highlighted that there is a general concern for ABFRs due to known or potential PBT or BPBB properties. However, it was also highlighted that further preparatory work was needed before any restriction dossier could be developed. Consequently, on December 2023, the European Commission requested ECHA to prepare an investigation report on flame retardants specifically focused on ABFRs. In the investigation report, which was published on December 2024, ECHA identified that non-polymeric additive ABFRs pose a higher burden compared to polymeric or reactive ABFRs. In addition, ECHA also identified that waste from electrical and electronic equipment, construction, and textile products is a key contributor for the release of those substances in the environment, and that potential alternatives are generally available. However, ECHA also noted that several groups of organophosphorus flame retardants may be regrettable alternatives. Finally, the European Commission now requested ECHA to prepare a restriction proposal for certain aromatic brominated flame retardants and an investigation report on organophosphorus flame retardants and other potential alternatives to ABFRs. And this is the subject of the current presentation. I will now explain the scope of the mandate on the restriction proposal, and then I will continue with the investigation report. The substances that are in the scope of the restriction mandate and that are explicitly mentioned in the mandate are 3 ABFRs that are already identified as substances of very high concern due to the very persistent and very bioaccumulative hazard properties. In addition, other substances containing those at or above 0.1% by weight are also in the scope. The 3 substances of very high concern are DBDPE, TBPH, and BTBPE, and you can see those in the slide highlighted in orange. In addition, 2 additional substances were identified in ECHA's database containing those at or above 0.1% by weight. It is important for you to note that the call for evidence covers more non-polymeric additive ABFRs than those in this slide, since the scope of the mandate may be expanded, as I will explain in the next slide. In the mandate, the European Commission also tasked ECHA to prepare 2 interim reports. In the first report, ECHA is requested to assess whether the available information is sufficient, for example, by using read-across or weight of evidence, to conclude on the PBT or BPBB properties of ABFRs other than those specifically mentioned in the mandate. In the second report, ECHA is requested to assess the feasibility to restrict any other non-polymeric ABFR that could be subject to harmonized classification as PBT or BPBB. This is known as dynamic link clause. Based on those 2 interim reports, the European Commission may decide to amend and expand the scope of the mandate. And therefore, the restriction may be based on 1 or more chemical group definitions. With regard to the product types that are in the scope of the mandate, there are 3 product types: electrical and electronic equipment in the scope of the ROS directive, construction products as defined by Construction Products Regulation, and textile products as defined in the Textiles Regulation. As I mentioned earlier, the mandate sent by the European Commission also contains a request for ECHA to prepare an investigation report on organophosphorus flame retardants and potential alternatives to certain non-polymeric ABFRs. This report is divided in 2 distinct parts. In the first part of the report, due in December 2026, the substances in the scope are the alternatives identified for the ABFRs in the scope of the restriction mandate. The purpose of this report is to inform about the risk of regrettable substitution. This report will contain hazard, exposure, and risk assessment of the identified alternatives, as well as the technical and economical feasibility of those. This report will support ECHA's committees in their assessment of the restriction dossier on ABFRs. The second part of the report is due in December 2027. In this case, the substances in the scope are all organophosphorus flame retardants. And the purpose of this report is to provide further information on hazard and risk properties of organophosphorus flame retardants and their current and potential future uses. The content of this report will include information on hazards, uses, emissions, and risks of organophosphorus flame retardants, as well as an assessment of the impact of a possible restriction of those on waste management and recycling. However, you should note that this second part of the report is not in the scope of the call for evidence and is not in the scope of the current webinar. Let me conclude with a brief explanation of the approach we are taking for the preparation of the restriction dossier. Considering the complexity of the mandate for the preparation of the restriction dossier, including the preparation of 2 interim reports, we are considering 3 restriction options. In restriction option 1, a total of 5 substances, which we call Group A, are considered to be restricted. In restriction option 2, a broader group of substances are considered to be restricted. This group includes the 5 substances in Group A and 19 additional substances, Group B, which were identified in the investigation report on ABFRs as non-polymeric additives with potential PBT or BPBB properties. Finally, in the restriction option 3, substances in Group A are considered to be restricted, and substances in Group B receiving a harmonized classification as PBT or BPBB, according to the CLP regulation, will be considered automatically restricted. In all restriction options, a ban on placing on the market of electrical and electronic equipment, construction, and textile products are foreseen when containing substances in scope above 0.1% by weight. And this is it from my side. Thank you very much for your attention, and we will be happy to respond to any questions that you may have in this regard. And have a nice day.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Nina Lazic. I am an economist working in ECHA in the risk management unit, and I am responsible for the preparation of the restriction dossier on non-polymeric aromatic brominated flame retardants, ABFRs. Today, I'm going to present you the survey that is being used in this call for evidence. So I will start by introducing to the survey. Then I will provide you with some practical tips for how to approach the questions, and then we'll look together at the content of the survey. So let's get started with an introduction to this survey. All responses are being collected using the U-Survey. This is the European Commission official survey management tool. You can find more information about this tool at this website, EU Survey About. The survey that is being used in this call for evidence includes 3 sections. There is the general surveys, which is for all the participants. Then there are 3 sector-specific surveys, which are for the actors using ABFRs in their activities. And finally, there is a survey for any actor that is not using ABFRs, but that wishes to provide information about this restriction. The main goal of this survey is to collect information on the socioeconomic impacts of the 3 restriction options that are currently being assessed by ECHA. In terms of our audience, we are targeting different types of actors. So, manufacturers of polymer compounds and their composites for electrical and electronic equipment, manufacturers of construction products or parts and materials for the construction products, and then any actor having information on the possible impacts of the restriction, and finally formulators that are using ABFRs to prepare formulations for the coating of textiles. As mentioned, we are primarily looking for information on the socioeconomic impacts of the various restriction options that are being considered by ECHA. I will give you now some practical tips for how to approach the survey. So, when you start the survey, please keep in mind the following instructions. So it is very important that you provide realistic information to the questions. Also, when relevant, try to add justification and additional information, and for this you will have the possibility to use these text-free boxes. Also, keep in mind that we're using the use survey to collect only non-confidential type of information. However, in the survey you can also find a link that you can use for submitting public and confidential attachments. Also, when you're working on the survey, remember to save always the draft responses. If you operate in different sectors, so for example, you use ABFRs in the production of construction products, as well as in the formulation of the mixtures for EE, you have to submit different responses. In terms of structure, the survey contains many multiple choice questions, and also many of these are complemented with free text boxes where you can provide additional information. Also, keep in mind that the survey covers different types of topics, meaning that you have to be prepared to consult with your colleagues, for example, from the R&D department, finance, and so on. Once you have collected all the necessary information, the filling in of the survey takes approximately 40 minutes. We will look now more into detail at the content of the survey. So, when you start the survey, you will see the first page, which includes detailed information about the restriction options. So, these are explained on this page, and you will see information on the products that are in scope of the restriction, as well as the substances. So, as a first step, please review carefully the information which is included on this page. Then, on the second page of the survey, you will have to provide information on the type of actor you are. So, for example, you will have to indicate whether you are a downstream user or an industry association representing, for example, some users of ABFRs, or if you are an actor that is not using ABFRs but wishing to submit information relevant to this restriction. On the second page of the survey, you will be asked to provide some general information about you and your activity and your country of domicile. Then we will ask for your email, and for companies, please submit additional information, for example, size and turnover. After providing general information about you and your activity, you will be presented with questions about the use of ABFRs. More specifically, you will be asked to provide information on the types of ABFRs that you are using, about the concentration in the relevant products, what tonnage of ABFRs you're using per year, the product types, and then you have the possibility also to respond that you are not using any of the listed ABFRs. By selecting this option, you will be then directed to the right form of the survey. After providing information about your use, you will be then asked to indicate how you would react in the restriction scenario. As mentioned earlier by my colleague, ECHA is now considering 3 different options. These options are different in terms of the substances being considered. Option 1 includes 5 ABFRs, option 2 includes 24, and finally option 3 includes the 5 ABFRs and also a specific legal clause according to which any ABFRs will also be automatically restricted in the future if it meets the harmonized classification as PBT or VB. When looking at the conditions, all the 3 options are the same, so they target the same types of products. Also, all 3 options assume an entrance into force in January 2030, and they also assume a transition period of 18 months. At this point of the survey, you will be asked to select your response to the restriction option 1, and you will have the possibility to choose from 3 options: full substitution, partial substitution, or non-substitution. Also, additional information on these responses are included in the survey. After you select your response, you will be then invited to provide information on the impacts which are specifically linked to your choice. So, depending on your response, you will be then receiving a different sets of questions. So, for example, if you select full substitution scenario, you will be asked questions about the substitution cost. So the cost related to R&D activities, the capital expenditure, CAPEX, and any additional operating expenditure costs that might be relevant. Also, you will be asked to indicate the alternatives that are likely to be used in the restriction scenario. If you select no substitution scenario, you will have to justify your response and then provide the information on the related impacts. So, for example, impacts in terms of profit losses or job losses. Also, if you choose this scenario, you will also have to explain what conditions could make the substitution possible. So, for example, a certain transition period. If you choose partial substitution, then you will receive questions which are common to both full substitution scenario and non-substitution scenario. Once you have completed the survey for the first restriction option, you will be then directed to the survey on the restriction option 2, so the option that includes 24 substances. Please note also that this survey for the restriction option 2 will be also received by actors that are using one or more of the substances of the group of 19 ABFRs presented earlier, but none of the 5 substances that are in scope of the first restriction option. In terms of content, this survey is adapted to the type of actor. Actors that have already filled in the survey for the restriction option 1 will have to explain to which extent the impacts of the restriction option 2 are expected to differ compared to the restriction option 1. Instead, actors that only use one or more substances from the group of the 19 ABFRs, the content of the survey will be the same as for the restriction option 1. This is because these types of actors cannot provide information on the incremental impacts compared to restriction option 1, as they are not using any of the 5 substances mentioned earlier. In the end, once you have completed the survey for restriction option 2, you will receive 1 question on the impacts of this restriction option 3. So, when responding to this question, please assume that there is a high chance that some of all of the substances that belong to the group of 19 ABFRs will in the future be classified as PBT or VPVB and within the next 10 years. Also, note that you will be requested to submit information only if you indicate that you expect that the impacts of the third restriction option is expected to differ compared to the restriction option 2. In other words, if you consider that the impacts of this restriction option 3 are the same as the impacts of the restriction option 2, you will not have to provide any specific information about restriction option 3. Finally, actors that do not use ABFRs, they will receive a specific survey covering many topics. So, for example, hazard of ABFRs, emissions, volumes, information on the available alternatives. They can also provide information on the positive and negative impacts of the restriction. Finally, to capture possible trade implications of this restriction, there are specific questions for the importers of mixtures and articles containing ABFRs, as well as for exported based outside the European Economic Area that are exporting to the EU mixtures and articles containing ABFRs. Finally, I would like to leave you with some key messages. So, providing precise information to certain questions can be very difficult. However, in these situations, we still hope that you will be able to provide reasonable estimates instead of leaving the questions unanswered. Also, please use the structured form in the survey, as this will allow the easy treatment of the data as well as subsequent analysis. Finally, keep in mind that your participation in this survey is very important, as this will allow us to consider all the relevant socioeconomic impacts of the considered restriction option. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Nina. That brings us to the end of our webinar. So let's summarize what you've heard today. First, on Marta's presentation on the restriction process, she explained that REACH restriction is a regulatory tool to protect human health and the environment from chemical risks. It involves preparing a detailed dossier, scientific committee review, and a stakeholder consultation. Restrictions can limit or ban substances or set specific conditions for their use. Then, on the mandate, 3 types of products are in scope: electrical and electronic equipment, construction products, and textiles. Now, while in the current mandate only a limited number of substances are mentioned, the Commission may clarify these substances that are in scope based on the 2 interim reports we talked about earlier. Finally, on how you can participate in the consultation. Nina explained that you're encouraged to give evidence and feedback via EU survey. We're looking for information on the use of aromatic brominated flame retardants, potential impacts of restriction options, and socio-economic considerations. Last but not least, we've given you guidance on how to answer, including the importance of realistic, well-supported responses, and we strongly advise that you send non-confidential information. So, as mentioned at the start, today's recording, slides, and the Q&A will be available at echa.europa.eu/webinars. Here are the details for joining the Q&A. We'll share a Q&A document with answers to all questions soon after the event. If your question is not answered in the Q&A or you need further support, contact us. Thank you so much for your active participation and for contributing to this important topic. The webinar will now end, but the Q&A remains open until 1 Helsinki time. Goodbye.